All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the School of Wrestling podcast. Today on the episode, I'm super excited to introduce you to Heather Reid. She is the author of this book, uh, Introduction to the Philosophy of Sport. She's a professor of the philosophy of sport, and she has studied extensively the Greek culture and how the Greeks viewed sport and how it connects to the sport of wrestling in particular. I'm super excited about this podcast. We talked about a ton of stuff that I had been talking about previously, like arete and the virtue ethics and how they used activity in sport as a way to cultivate virtue. Heather Reid is an expert in this area that I think is going to help the wrestling community and hopefully maybe even more people outside of the wrestling community kind of understand the role of philosophy and how it pertains to sport, to give us maybe a better understanding as to why we should participate in sport collectively as a society. I hope you enjoy this episode, and thanks for watching. All right, Heather Reid, thank you for coming on the podcast. I've been lucky enough to already have met you and talked to you a few times, as well as read a lot of your work. But I'm super excited to kind of introduce you to an audience of people who I think there's a lot of opportunity to kind of utilize the philosophy aspect with sport. One, as your book alludes, it's not that philosophy of sport was kind of the originator. It was that sport was used in the explanation of philosophy. Is that correct?
Yeah, although I have to say that sport is older than philosophy.
Okay.
But you could say that there was a philosophy before sport that has to do with heroes and the mythology surrounding heroes. So there's a philosophy in that sense. But before people like Socrates and Plato and even show up and start inventing this thing called ethics, you have sport and it's being practiced in ancient Greece.
Okay. And so, so all this stuff exists, but when I became interested in your work, I came across a piece that you had written called "Wrestling with Socrates," and it kind of connected me to this idea of combining the sport of wrestling to philosophy, which were at the moment two separate endeavors of mine. Right, I had obviously gone out and wrestled my whole life, and I came to philosophy through a interest in understanding the universe better, right? Because I did not connect with a religion or theology that made sense. So I was looking for answers in different places. So I found philosophy, and I specifically found Plato and Socrates, and in the process had two separate things. And then when I came across your work, I kind of had the opportunity to merge them together and make so much more sense out of my experience with wrestling and like with my existence in the world. So it was really cool to kind of see that there was actually a connection to wrestling long before I tried to make the connection. So your work kind of illuminated that. But I've been talking to people a lot about your book, The Philosophy of Sport. And what I wanted to do is kind of just introduce you and say, well, one, how did you get into studying the philosophy of sport, and kind of explain what it is?
Great. Well, I had been a practicing athlete like you, Dalton, since before, since high school and before I even started college. And in college, I studied both literature, especially English literature, and also philosophy. And I was also very, very active athlete. I was actually intercollegiate cycling champion in 1986. So I was really seriously working in athletics, and I was serious as a student and interested in philosophy. And at a certain point, I decided to go to graduate school in philosophy. And while I was there, I took a seminar on Plato, and I just seemed to be able to kind of understand what he was saying, or I seemed to have a kind of facility with him that I noticed other people didn't have. So it's kind of like when you're an athlete, you're pretty good at one particular sport or something, you have a kind of feel for it. And as time went on, I realized that as I put it, Plato thinks like a jock. And then it turns out that he had been an athlete. And I started to think that maybe one of the reasons that I could kind of understand the way he was thinking is because through my experience in sport, I understood sport, or we both understood a common thing, this kind of what you might call an agonistic or a competitive way of looking at ethics and excellence and things like that that play out in both philosophy and the practice of sport. So just by doing sport, and it doesn't matter what sport you do, I think that you through experience you learn a kind of a philosophy, and then what happens is when you study philosophy, you'll get all the vocabulary and the words and the story and all that stuff that goes with it. But in a way, you already knew it because you were living it as an athlete.
And so quickly, do you think that one has to come before the other?
Yeah,
The
I don't
reason,
know. I mean, it depends because you can mean so many different things by different words. Like when you say philosophy, do you mean having a theory about, the universe, or even more specifically about who we are and how we ought to live? I think everybody, even as children, we develop these kinds of ideas, partly from our environment, partly from how we're taught, and hopefully from some independent thought and our own experiences about, how we want to live. And so we're already doing philosophy in that sense. But actually studying philosophy, especially in America, most people don't do it until college, if then. We don't have it at, in a lot of places, like here in Italy, you'll study philosophy in high school and even middle school sometimes,
yeah,
but not in America. And so I think that I don't think it matters which one you do first, but I do think that especially for ancient Greek philosophy and these ideas of virtue ethics, that it's really helpful to have been an athlete, and having been an athlete can help you to understand in a lot of ways the way they're thinking. Because, sport is in a way is like a miniature life, or it's a place in which we express our philosophies of life in kind of a miniature way, because we perform, and you could say you perform in life too, but you have to actually act out what you believe, and there's a kind of a truth. This is one of the things I say about like the similarity between philosophy and sport. In sport too, you start with a question and a doubt and an uncertainty, and you try and clarify that. You try to improve that by asking questions and then answering them with your actions. You can't just make something up. I mean, that's what's really beautiful about sport, and so it teaches you this kind of truth back, because the performance is there and it's public, and you have to deal with it and other people too.
yeah. The reason why I ask is oftentimes when I'm trying to make sense of this, or try to bring up these ideas, it seems like it would be very challenging to go to young people and explain to them that they should develop some sort of philosophy for what they're doing. When I look at activity in sports, it's all more like again, like you said, the hero mythology, Joseph Campbell talking about the hero's journey. Like athletics to me seems like it's more of a hero's journey, and the journey itself creates like the foundation, and then you can go back with the philosophy and kind of like make sense of it. But if you started with the philosophy, you'd almost not understand why you would do something, because you don't necessarily see the result that you would be after.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't think you could say, yeah, I think you're right about that. I don't think you'd say, I'm going to read, Plato's Republic, and then I'm going to go out and try to play my sport, as an expression of that. I don't think that would make sense. It would be a sensical way to do it. But I do think that it's good to understand your athletic experience, and even your your expression of yourself through sport as an expression of your philosophy of life, as saying something about who you are and what you care about and things like that. And I do think, especially for young people who a lot of times experience sport as responding to commands that other people give them, that they do need to think about taking, some trying to express themselves through what they do too. I mean, you can't, obviously in sport we play by rules, people have coaches, you can't just make it up as you go along, like Calvin Ball, that comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, when Calvin would play this game called Calvin Ball, and Calvin would just declare the rules whenever he wanted. And of course, it was impossible to have a sport because you didn't know what the criteria were. So you can't treat sport like that. But you can think about how the way you play sport expresses what you really believe and who you really are. And you can both shape those things through your performance. In other words, I can express who I am and who I want to be through sport. And I can sort of set goals in there that better express who I want to be.
Yeah.
For example, if you know that you have a hard time getting motivated, but once the competition starts, that you're really quick to be motivated, you can set goals for yourself, and you can do little things to improve so that you can try to take control of what motivates you and things like that. So it's kind of like, you can almost think of it as a little personal experiment area where you can try different aspects of your personality.
Yeah, I would agree. The reason why I mentioned that is just because, I'm trying to figure out the best possible way to relay the information, right? And so
Yeah.
in particular, like all the coaches that are involved, or at least a large percentage of coaches that are involved, have already had gone through this experience. So the philosophy is a little bit easier to teach them. And then on top of that, trying to explain to parents who are also guiding their children the philosophy aspect so that they can detach themselves from the superficial stuff that we're kind of going to get into discussing, in your first chapter of the book. I'm trying to decide or come to grips with who I'm actually communicating to on this topic, as opposed to thinking that I can just coach kids to kind of understand it, because it seems like it's a much more challenging thing to talk to them. But I totally agree with the idea that there's another reason why I love individual sports is because it allows for that individual expression of your personality to kind of come out, and you kind of get to do it the way that you want to do it, because you're not associated with a group of people. You get to do things in your fashion, regardless of other people's interests, habits, or their motivations. It's kind of something that you get to express. In wrestling in particular, right? I get to express how motivated I am as opposed to others because of the individual aspect of it. I get to also express how I want to compete, where somebody at a different place or somebody else completely might compete in an entirely different process, right? So I definitely totally agree that I think there is a way to encourage and to develop a personal representation of sport at the individual level. I just think that I'm trying to determine who I'm communicating philosophy to. I think that it's the people who have gone through the journey, who have the context, who have the experience of life, really, because what philosophy seems to do is obviously it presents what you define as a process of truth seeking that acknowledges the fallibility of existing beliefs and structures, a relatively rational and impartial process to finding a universally accepted answer. Right. And so like that comes through this idea of looking at what is, and then going back in and saying what actually is, and then calling out, the hypocrisy or the contradictions of the process. So
I think a couple comments on that. One is to not think of it as information. I mean, just like the sentence you just read out is very complicated, and certainly children aren't going to understand it. And even a lot of adults aren't going to understand it. A lot of educated people won't understand it on the linguistic level. But in a way, they understand it through their experience. And they don't necessarily wouldn't use those words or wouldn't explain it that way, but they've got an experience of it. So one way, instead of thinking of it as information that you're putting into somebody, think of it as like kind of a rough or a raw experience that they already have, that you're trying to help them to communicate and appreciate and sort of activate by having the words and being able to talk to them about it. And so it's like, think of it as something that's already there, and then you're sort of uncovering. They used to say Michelangelo would look at this, this sort of shit piece of marble and see the statue in there, and then he would just remove everything that wasn't the statue. And that was, I don't even know if that's true, but the idea is that it's already there. And one thing I think with kids is, the other thing is just kind of trust sport. You're putting them in a sport, constructs a place where they can learn about themselves and they can be challenged. And so really you're just sort of constructing this mechanism that allows them just to learn about themselves. And they're not going to, at the end of the sport come out with some formula like you just read. But they're going to learn something just from that experience, even if it's not verbal or can't be expressed verbally. And so I don't know if you have to worry about sort of teaching them about philosophy. They're already doing philosophy just by being alive and living. And especially if they just think about that, think about what
Yes,
their experience means for them.
I would agree. And I think the only point that I'll ever in the process be trying to do is trying to point out that what they're doing is philosophy. And so that,
Yeah.
again, we'll get into the first chapter of your book, because I think it would be fun to kind of go through and introduce you. And if we get to have more conversations about this, go through the entirety of that book, because I think there's a lot of topics that will just make people think a little bit deeper than they're traditionally capable of doing. And so going into that first component of athletics and philosophy and Greek education, I wanted to ask you about arete, because it seems that there were two different definitions, one in Hellenic times and then Socratic view of it. So arete, the word arete meant what?
Well, really, arte is a word that expresses the excellence of any kind of thing at performing its function. So if you have a thing like a knife, its function is to, cut through, vegetables or whatever. So what do you want? You want something that's sharp. You want something that's balanced, doesn't rust, blah, blah, blah. So that's the concept. And then when you apply it to a human being, you say, well, what is excellence in a human being? And how do we achieve it? Now, the way the Greeks thought about it is they imagined their gods as sort of perfected human beings. They had their gods, what we call anthropomorphic, the shape of human beings. And so in a lot of ways, gods, and then below gods, heroes who were actually mortal, but had certain perfections, not total perfections, then sort of inspired other human beings or mortals to try to be more like heroes and more like gods. And so really arte is this idea of excellence in human beings. And because there's so many different kinds of human beings and so many different roles and all that, there's a lot of different conceptions, like individual ideas of what arte is, but the general idea is this idea of excellence, which we also, I think you thought there were two kinds, because we also translate it as virtue, which can seem like a different thing than excellence. But it's not in the Greek context. Being excellent and being virtuous is pretty much the same thing. It has to do with the quality of a thing in its ability to do what it was made to do.
The Greeks believed that arete was the highest form of virtue, correct?
Well, short of being a god, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing is there are different virtues, like courage, for example, or self-control. The Greeks called it self-resune. And then there's and those are called aratai, plural. But there's the general idea is just the excellence. And then it's different depending on what it's applied to, whether it's a human being or something else. And for some people, it's different if it's applied to a man or a woman or a child or an old person or whatever. The actual content of it can change, but the general idea is the same as excellence. And that's one of the good things about virtue ethics, is that instead of having a set of fixed rules, or like in any given situation saying that the right thing, the moral thing to do is this particular thing, they basically say, just be excellent, just be the best you can be. And then whatever the excellent person, whatever the virtuous person does in a given situation will be right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important to mention, because it's not a specific act. It's kind of how you act, right?
Yes.
It's cool. And so, taking that concept of arete and going into two other concepts of soma and psyche, I was hoping that you could do a better job of explaining these two, because one of the things I think it leads into is the activity of sport, right? And so soma and psyche, how did the Greeks look at that?
Okay, so soma is the word that the Greeks would use for our body. And then psyche is the word they would use for mind, but also soul. And so when you think of a soma, a body, you want to think of the material aspect of a human being, everything that's made of matter, right? Blood, water, skin, muscles, everything. When you think of a psyche, you want to think of what we might call the spiritual or the mental or the non-material part. The thing the part of you that thinks, the part of you that has emotions, the part of you, for the Greeks even, that has appetites. Like if you're hungry and you feel hungry, a lot of times we'll think of that as something in your body, but the Greeks would think of it as something in your soul. So there's obviously a connection between body and soul, because your body will sort of tell or connects with the soul in a way that's going to make you feel hungry when you need food, when your body needs food or something like that. But the training, the thing that's most under your control is actually your psyche, not your body. So the way I like to explain it is, think about it like a race car driver, where your body is the race car and the driver is your psyche. So to get the race car to perform really well, you have to have both a really good, well designed and well, we would say trained, but a well-prepared car. But then what the driver does is the driver, makes the car perform things as best it can. So the relationship between the body and the soma and the psyche is really important. And in Greek thought, it's really, really close to the point where they feel like the intentional movement of the body, which can be sport, but sometimes it's easier to think about things like dance, or even if you've ever done martial arts and you do the forms, where you go through certain prescribed movements, that kind of intentional movement of the body would actually train your psyche, train your soul or your mind to work better. So in a lot of ways, you should think of, or the Greeks would think of, training of the body, or just athletics or gymnastics was the word they like to use, as actually training for the soul. Whereas we think in modern times, a lot of we go, I'm training my body, I'm going to the gym for my body. But for the Greeks, you don't have that. You have a distinction between body and mind, but movement of the body is something that always involves and conditions the soul. So they're thinking about it in terms of psyche, in terms of soul.
Yeah. And so to kind of relate it to wrestling, one of the things, like, so wrestling, there's technique, right? There's all sorts of techniques, but when you get into an actual wrestling match, it's kind of more feel, right? Like it's more of like, because they're resisting doing their techniques and strategies and you're trying to implement yours. But during the process of development, right, especially through later years of high school and definitely college, one of the consistent acts is habitual repetition of certain movements with almost zero resistance. And you do reps upon reps upon reps upon reps, right? And when I was younger, I was told the 10,000 rep rule, like get 10,000 good reps in and your body will recognize the act that it's trying to perform. And then I explain this through, like, as you get older, you have these moments of epiphanies, right? You have epiphany states along the way where in the act of, full resistance, the technique that you're demonstrating or practicing has like an opportunity to fully mature and make sense, right? And so there's this moment that your brain literally goes, oh, I understand completely what I was trying to perfect in the repetitions. And so one of the things that I think is very important and beneficial in wrestling is to get people to engage in the repetitive acts. But oftentimes intellectually, people debate the idea that that's actually important because so much of competitive wrestling has to do with feel and kind of like, I guess, improvisation with your body. And so like, it's kind of weird because it's like, well, there's benefit to the repetitive action of the technique that's maybe not necessarily in relationship to the competitive outcome, but it is in relationship to the development of the psyche, or the driver of the car, right? And so I think that's an interesting correlation between those two.
Well, and the way you were describing it too, in terms of body and brain, is different than the way the Greek athlete would think about it. The Greek athlete would think about these repetitions as really repetitions of moving the driver, making the car do all these things to the point where the driver gets so used to it. And obviously the car breaks in a little bit, but the driver gets so used to it that she no longer has to consciously think about it. I mean, one of the things about about mind, and the idea of psyche is now in modern times, a lot of times we confuse the calculating, conscious, think it through, planning part of our mind with the whole soul. Whereas things that you could say are unconscious, or some people will say things like instinctual, or you said, I think, in improvised, or those things are also part of the mind. And there's actually really cool stuff in Eastern philosophy about this, about clearing out the mind, about concepts like no mind motion, about being able to try without trying, to think without thinking, by clearing the clutter out of your mind. Yeah. So a lot of it is that it isn't so much, just words like body and mind, is that the conception of mind that a lot of times we deal with, or we're taught to deal with, are too narrow to really kind of capture what a mind is. And one of the things that, like you say, I mean, I want to say, when you were talking about something maturing, I was thinking also sometimes just clicks. It finally becomes, I mean, they'll say, I've heard terms like muscle memory. Well, muscles don't have memories, but there is a kind of, let's call it, the Greeks would say something like a harmony between mind and body that is achieved like a notes on a scale in music, and boo, you hit that right tone, and then it just flows perfectly, and it flows naturally. And that's of course, and those kind of phenomena are attested even in ancient times among athletes and in other kinds of performances too.
Yeah. So last week on the podcast, I was explaining to somebody about the higher states of consciousness that are kind of achieved through elite level athletics, but in particular wrestling. And it's like in college, there's a point of your training that gets so good that at the end of certain practices where you've been competing for so long, it becomes that flow state. It becomes the detachment of which one are you in control of, and it's just moving in unison. It's just working together. And so that's kind of what I was referring to.
Yeah, you don't have to go, well, when he does this, I'm supposed to do that. And you don't have to think it through. It all just flows.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm trying to make a point about when it comes to this, right? And again, it's really hard to conceptualize in just simple sentences. But, for me, I feel like there's like this process to achieving that point of mind and body connection that people don't necessarily have the motivation to aspire after, right? So people aren't aspiring after the point in which you can kind of like be in that state of flow. Instead, they're after accolades or some sort of superficial means. So they're not actually seeing that the purpose of the repetitions isn't for the accolades, it's for the ability to reach a state of mind-body unison.
Right. That is then recognized by the accolade. The accolades are supposed to recognize that achievement.
Yeah.
There's an interesting concept. You were talking about college, and I had recently written a paper for the Journal of Intercollegiate Studies, and I was talking about the value of collegiate sport. And one of the things I was talking about is the idea of forming a performance community. In other words, and this would be like a really elite level group in any sport, where you have all these people who are, as a community, moving their way up the ladder toward this, this kind of mind-body unison, or this idea, or even you might call that arete. They're committed to this level of excellence that requires them to make kind of an odd commitment and give up most of the normal things that, sort of normal people and other students care about. And I think that that's actually really important, because in any kind of an endeavor, whether it's business or art or, anything, the people who become really excellent, I think, have to in some ways depart from sort of the normal concerns and normal lifestyles that they see around them. And they do this, and by finding other people that are committed to excellence like you are, then through competition and also through cooperation, you push yourself higher and you form this community. And then sometimes you can kind of communicate, even if you don't have philosophical language, you can communicate about what that means to have, a really great move or a really great match, quite apart from the result. I mean, I think most athletes, many, if not most, will identify their best performances in something that didn't necessarily win. And there have been times they've won and they didn't have that great of performance. At the time, maybe their best performance didn't result in a win, but you still value that. It's this sort of ultimate achievement of what you were going for.
Yeah.
And other athletes can understand that. That's what I mean by performance community, people that are focused on excellence and performance, on what the Greeks would call arete. They can recognize each other and they can support each other and push each other to keep
Yeah.
getting better.
And what you're saying is important and relevant in the times, because one of the arguments or the thesis that I have come to is like, a lot of the people inside the wrestling community are confused as to why more people don't watch the highest level of wrestling, right? They're trying to justify or conceptualize why they choose to watch other sports as opposed to wrestling. And for me, I keep explaining that in order for somebody to recognize the unique difference between the elite level skill, they have to possess an understanding of how difficult that skill is to possess, right?
Yeah.
So instead of trying to make it entertaining, so this is what happens with the Western society, is they go, okay, how do we make this into a way in which we can profit from it from an entertainment value? And for me, I keep continuing to go back to, wrestling is not about entertainment. It's about literally this again, what you're suggesting, this cultivating a collective group of understanding and recognizing what that behavior actually is and how difficult it is to obtain that level of skill. And it's just a difference in philosophy, because they think that you can get that interest in people that have no recognizing ability of the skill. They just want to watch it to see who wins, whether it's US or Russia, who wins the competition. Whereas to fully engage in that, you have to appreciate the art form so much that you can recognize the level of discipline and intention that goes into accomplishing that act itself. And so for me, as somebody who has wrestled my entire life, who is in a practice room of some kind multiple times a week, when I see somebody at that level compete, I go, wow, that is a fascinating display of their strategy and skill. At the same time, somebody equally as strategic and skilled is trying to execute their strategy and skill. So it's like, I appreciate that in a way different way than somebody else can appreciate it. And it's all because I think we've lost sight of this idea of arete and the excellence of the process, right? Like trying to engage people in the process of obtaining excellence. Instead, Western society has said, because you're involved in sports, it's good for you. Instead of thinking like, if you're involved in sports while pursuing your arete in your said endeavor, then you will achieve this higher state. So it's like, it's a very confused culture, because again, the number of people who have chosen to take that call and discipline themselves for the pursuit of arete in their endeavor is such a smaller percentage of people, that the larger percentage of people don't recognize that that's the actual pursuit. They recognize the other stuff as the pursuit. And so trying to explain that is hard.
It's really unfortunate. I mean, one of the things is, I'm the first one to say, look, sports intrinsically speaking are meaningless. I mean, there's really nothing very meaningful in wrestling about being able to pin another person to the ground. If you take the whole question of the virtues that the arete that you need in order to do that, and then that arete could be used to do all kinds of effective things for people in all kinds of endeavors. And so instead of looking at arete and excellence as the sort of the wages, the earnings that we get from participating in sport, we look at it too much in terms of actual monetary reward or prizes, or maybe just attention, like you're talking about, how many viewers do you get, how many people watch the sport, how much adulation do they give the winners, and those kinds of things. And it's funny because those things, as far as I'm concerned, like in the economy of sport, I mean, the whole reason sport is entertaining to begin with is because it's fascinating to watch people who put their arete on display in these totally constructed synthetic activities that are just spectacular, because you're seeing humanity do this. And I think the Olympic Games does just an amazing job at showing at becoming a showcase for arete and showing just all the different kinds of virtue that people can have, and all the different kinds of people who can have arete, and all the different ways they can have it. I remember in the last Olympic Games, there was some kind of a running race, and this guy got out there on the refugee team who's I mean, obviously he was a refugee, he's had a hard life. He starts this race, and I think his hamstring snapped or something, and he fell to the ground and had to kind of crawl to the end. And I thought, man, there you go. This guy just cannot get a break. But the way he got up and the way he dealt with that showed such, beautiful grace and perseverance and all that. It was as good as, it's better than watching someone win.
Yeah.
And so that's the other thing, the aspect of sport where it's not just about winning, it's about being the kind of, I always say, being the kind of person that deserves to win, about having the kind of virtues that sometimes, not reliably, but tend to result in success in sports.
Yeah.
And I think for people like us who care about sport and those things, it's also for trying to make sure sports preserve their ability to evoke those kinds of things by making sure that you can't win just with money or with cheating or with, by denigrating other people and stuff that's not virtuous.
Yeah. No, I would fully agree with that. So now going into that, going into Socrates, and Socrates talking about education and what education is. And he says that any education that does not pursue arete should not be considered education. Right. And so this is kind of what we're alluding to. And I recited a quote from, I think it was the Wrestling with Socrates one, where that you referenced. You said it has no business in our society if it is not aimed at achieving arete. Right. And it was like thinking about sports programs, cultural experiences that are so tied to, superficial means. Right. It's like this idea that education is simply one thing, and it is a pursuit or activity that is aspiring to achieve arete.
Yeah, the quote is actually from the one that you said about we can't call it education if it doesn't lead to arete. That's actually from Plato and one of the characters in his Laws. But I think it applies to society. I mean, and I make that argument, especially for college sports. I said in college, you shouldn't have sports programs there if they're not educational. And what's the education that they're building? And it has to do with this idea of building up, excellence that can then be applied to other kinds of endeavors that are more meaningful. I mean, there's nothing more meaningful than becoming the best person you can be. So it's not that sport is meaningless as a way to become the best person you can be. It's just meaningless by itself. Just kicking a ball into a net, or whatever the goal is that you achieve in sport, that's meaningless. What's meaningful is what it does to us, what it can do to us as human beings. It's a very humanistic idea that human beings, we fall so short of what we could be. We could be so much better than we are, and we have to struggle to be better than our most base instincts. And that's a struggle, and it's really a noble struggle, and sports helps it with this. But that's what gives sport its value, not how many viewers it brings in or all these kinds of things, how many ribbons you get and so on.
And it's really, I mean, it's what has set me out on this exploration to try to bring about this conversation that is literally not existent inside any type of cultural space inside my sport, specifically the sport of wrestling. There is there is little discussion. There is definitely discussion where people say this is about the development of the person, and we care about developing the kids and stuff like that. But it's always used in a way to excuse arete, right? It's never actually used in truth. It's always used to avoid or to make excuses for not fully applying themselves in the act of wrestling.
Oh, really? I mean, so they say,
well, it's almost always
like, oh, well, it doesn't matter if you skip practice or you aren't respectful, because the point of it is just, it's just to make you a better person. It doesn't matter if you're good at it or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm obviously generalizing my experience with it. I'm sure there are very good examples of people using, I've found personal examples of people actually doing it the right way or doing it the truthful way. But in general sense, like I would say that oftentimes people use that as an excuse to not apply the same principles. Because again, the thing that's so hard for people to understand is like when you pursue arete, you become somebody who is worthy of victory. And,
Mhm.
you know, this is what I loved
Try
about
to, yeah.
this is what I loved about the Greeks, because they talked about not thinking that you're chasing the outcome, but that you become worthy of such an outcome, right? As if like
Right.
the gods honor you for your
Yeah.
discipline and effort.
Yeah,
And
because they're in the ancient religious context where sport emerges, they're thinking of sort of the gods as watching and choosing, who wins. And so, you want to be worthy, and you feel, the one who's worthy is it will be chosen. And the other thing is though, but that striving to be worthy is also worthwhile. They don't, I mean, one of the good things about Arte, it's actually better, than making winning your only criterion, because this way people can benefit. You can be sort of a champion of Arete, even if you don't necessarily win your particular sport. I mean, certainly success and failure in sport is should partly be conditioned by Arete. I mean, you should do better, but obviously we all have different potentials and stuff like that. But this allows people to educationally achieve all kinds of things in sport, regardless of whether their sport is popular and gets on TV and whether they win a college scholarship or anything. That's, I think, is especially important for a lot of these things. If you think about it in the back of your head, is especially true for women, because women, given the car that their driver had, no matter how good your driver is, their car tends to be not quite as fast as the guys, so to speak. That physically you maybe don't have quite the same potential on average as others. And you never probably, like they talk about women's sports, and they should be equal. And there is a sense in which some women's sports become as popular as the men. Sometimes they're more, like in gymnastics. It seems like women's gymnastics is more popular than men's gymnastics for whatever reason. But usually it's the men's version that's more popular. But just like you were saying, popularity isn't necessarily an indicator of quality. Like I'm sure in wrestling, you guys probably don't have a lot of respect for the whole phenomenon of world wrestling entertainment and those sorts of things, which it seems to me as an outsider kind of denigrates authentic wrestling by turning it into a show that pretends to be wrestling but isn't wrestling at all. The outcomes are determined. It's, they hit each other with chairs, stuff like that. And it's sort of like, so this isn't wrestling. This is, it's a thing.
it's theater.
It's not wrestling.
Yeah, it's theater, and to be honest, the unfortunate emerging phenomenon is that it's going towards that. It's going towards the
Yeah.
spectacle aspect of competition, and some of this stuff I'm not totally against, right? Creating a spectacle for entertainment purposes. Like if you want to create theater, okay, I would be okay with that, as long as you're acknowledging that this is not the pursuit that others should go after for the purpose of the sport, right? Like, so it's like the UFC Ultimate Fighting Championships, right? That is ultimately promotion. It's World Wrestling Federation. It's championship promotion. It's getting the masses to participate in watching your contest. Now, I'm okay with that as long as those who are part of the contest and those who are encouraging the growth of the contest recognize that the contest itself is separate from the process of the activity itself, right? Like there's two different worlds, right? Like the act of martial arts is an act of martial arts. You should apply discipline, respect, honor, consistency, and all these types of developmental aspects to it. But in the sense of the contest, making it attractive to the masses could be beneficial if you want to permeate those values further into the culture. But again, it's kind of like right now, it's real hard to distinguish what is the goal. There's no leadership of these philosophical ideas because it's so motivated by financial means that any type of questioning of like that thing jeopardizes the whole thing. And so it's definitely leading, you'd be surprised, it's going so much towards entertainment that it's just losing a lot. Like again, it's like I've been motivated to start this conversation because I'm a retired athlete, but I'm still an athlete. I'm still a wrestler. And what I see young people aspiring for is for the social credit that comes with accomplishing success, right? And so,
Yeah.
you even talk about that in the book, that where does it say that? Well, this talks about in the academic gymnasium, you say athletes who train for superficial goals such as appearance, admirers, and even winning fame and riches in the games are effectively letting their souls go to waste. And I thought that was a great quote to encapsulate the current Western society, because it's like so many kids are getting lost and their souls are going to waste. Literally, obviously, right? This is literal, because so many are chasing something that is only capable of being obtained by the small percentage, right? So if you have contests,
Yeah.
there's only a small percentage that gets to achieve the riches and the success. And so the vast majority, the vast majority of people are being led to stray. They're, led to stray because of these social pressures, and now they don't get to develop their soul. And this
Yeah.
is the spiritual connection to the sports world. It's like, if we want to be on our dying day, like our deathbed, knowing that our souls are ready for the afterlife, like we have to go through that process. And superficially, the things that people are setting people up for today are just, I mean, it's very unfortunate. Like very few high school programs, high school, athletic directors or educational systems have a philosophy towards their athletic programs. When I
Yeah.
was coaching at a high school program over here locally, I asked the athletic director, I said, "What is your philosophy? Why do you think it's important for kids to be a part of sports?" And there's no answer. There's no answer.
If
But
it's not obvious to you.
yeah,
But it's not, I mean, it's not obvious, and especially for kids. I mean, we started out kind of talking, in a positive way about how by experiencing sport, we have an idea about what matters. But unfortunately, there's no public discourse about it. So especially when you talk about kids, if all they ever hear is, how much money somebody can make or save or whatever, um, it's hard for them to have other kinds of values. I mean, it's like what kind of, how do you measure the value of something? And if the measurement always has to be in dollars, and it's for me, it's, you're impoverished, because the funny thing about that is that if the thing that matters, the thing that has value is in fact money, then how come there's so many unhappy rich people, and in some of the richest countries of the world, or some of the unhappiest countries in the world? Obviously, um, there are other things that have value, and can make a bigger contribution to happiness. And the thing about arete that gives it value, I mean, one thing is it gives you some, perspective on what matters, but also it's something that can be applied to other endeavors. And then if with youth is a really great time to really focus on sport. And even Plato said, he had in his ideal city this 2-year period, kind of between the ages of around 18 and 20, or 20 to 22, where people could devote their lives completely to sport, to exercise, gymnastics, but the rest of the time they were supposed to be doing practical things, dealing with military training and other kinds of things. But the thing about heritage, you can apply it to other endeavors, and most of us eventually, I mean, at a certain point, at a certain age, you're no longer going to be the best that you could be at sport, but you can use all those things you learn in sport in some other kind of meaningful career or endeavor. And so the sad thing is, if you treat sport during your youth as the only thing that matters, and you don't use it to develop arete, then when you're no longer capable of being really excellent in sport, you're also not capable of being excellent in anything else, because you don't even have the arete to apply to these other kinds of activities, which you attributed no value, gave no value to. So you're right. It's dangerous, and it's troubling that we're so focused on that. I mean, even just, you can see it in administrative stuff, like, Olympic committees judge the success of their programs by the number of medals won. I mean, it's just a stupid way to do it, because if you read the Olympic Charter and what the whole purpose of the movement is, it has nothing to do with medals, and it's certainly not a competition between countries anyway. And even if it was a competition between countries, then it wouldn't be fair, because we don't have the same events, we don't have the same number of athletes. It's just,
well, at some point along the way, the Olympics was hijacked by political, motives, right? Who can win elections based on, stuff like that. And we saw that with Icarus in Russia, that
That was interesting. Yeah.
basically Putin cheated in order to help his chances of getting no uncontested elections, right? And we see that all the time when people brag about how good we are at athletics, and somehow that's a demonstration of our ethics or our
Right.
ability
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
and this is one of the things that's really interesting about your book, that talks about how sports have always been used in society. I mean, they've been used to demonstrate, or I don't know how to say demonstrate, because demonstrate's a bad word, because obviously our leaders do not demonstrate either any of the athletic values, like even like the idea of the competitive contest, right? Like the competitive argument that Socrates brings out, or the act of discipline, the physical body, right? Our leaders are not demonstrating physical prowess. And then on top of that, the idea of competitive intellectual arguments is not being done. So the athletic aspect, it seems to be hijacked. And that's why I'm so interested in bringing Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to the forefront of just the wrestling community in general, is just because it's a new way of thinking about how we interact with society. And sometimes I've even heard people say, when it comes to athletics, or people in athletics talk politically, they go, "Oh, you're talking politics, I'm out. I was here for
Yeah.
sports." And it's
Yeah.
like, well, sports, society, politics, culture, it's all literally a manifestation of this pursuit of arete. And it's like, it's all together. And how do you get rid of one without communicating the other? So it's definitely an interesting time. But again, I think that it's actually primed, but today it's primed more now than ever to kind of reemerge these ideas. I really think I'm much more optimistic about these ideas actually taking foothold. Like, I think that they're actually going to be able to manifest, because people are now at the point where, whether it's college athletics, right? Like, if you're not in one of the major sports, it still costs $25,000+ a year. So now, to go to pursue college athletics is not necessarily capable of being the goal, because college is so expensive that it's not necessarily the next thing for somebody to do, right? And so because of that, now there's alternatives that are going to be constructed. And with those alternatives, I think that creates the opportunity for, the modern gymnasia. And that's what I'm intrigued to try to build. And so going into, kind of that concept of the gymnasia and what it looks like. And I was just curious if you could, end this podcast, we kind of could talk about the gymnasia, because the next time we talk, I really want to kind of get a little bit more insight into how I could go about thinking about how I would structure a gymnasia around these types of ethic training, while also still holding the athletic journey intact. But, in the Greek sense, like what was a gymnasia? What was it for? And what did it look like?
So the word gymnasium is, so it's singular in Greek as gymnasion, Gymnasion, and then plural, and then gymnasium is the Latinizing of that, and then gymnasia is actually the plural. But what gym means is actually refers to nudity, because when people did exercise in the ancient world, the Greeks would exercise in the nude. And probably that people have different theories for this. I think it had a lot to do with religion. Even today, some religions, when you're baptized, you're supposed to be naked, or at least naked in your clothes, but this idea of being naked before God, and then that connects to truth. And there's a lot of symbolism in it. But the word just comes from the place where people exercised. And originally they started out, it was just a park where people would get together and exercise, especially young men. Generally, young women would not be out and about alone. So young men would go to these places and exercise. And what happened is, as philosophers and other educators they used to just have elementary education. So as other philosophers and other people wanted to educate young men who had just had elementary education in more things, they would actually go to gymnasia in order to find the young men and to talk to them. And one of these was of course Socrates. And he would go and question people. And a lot of times he would talk about actually wrestling with them, but kind of as a social thing, to talk to them about, what mattered and what they thought it meant to be a good person and what they thought piety was. And so these places called gymnasia became not just for exercise, but also for what you might call intellectual conversation. And then when Plato wrote all of these dialogues in which he describes Socrates going to this gymnasia and another thing called the palestra, which was a kind of a private, gymnasia were public areas, and the palestra were private wrestling schools. They actually started to build buildings in these park grounds, and it usually was kind of a square, what they call a peristyle building, where there was a square row of rooms all around, open to a courtyard in the middle, and the courtyard in the middle was dirt, and the guys would usually exercise in the dirt. So you would go in the courtyard in the middle. So you would go into the gym. You didn't exercise indoors. You would go into the gymnasium. There was a room where you could take your clothes off. It was called the apoditerion, where you would take your clothes off and leave them there. Sometimes there would be, in some big cities and stuff, they would have a slave, or you would bring a slave to watch your clothes while you were exercising. And then there were other rooms where you could oil up, other rooms where you could bathe. Often, at least by Roman times, there were toilets and other things that you wouldn't have at home, bathing and toilet facilities and things like that. So it was really a place to go and to socialize and to exercise. And one thing that's really interesting I discovered in my research is that as more people read these stories that Plato wrote about Socrates, the architectural style of the gymnasium started to follow and started to expand to the point where they actually had what they called exedra, which was kind of a semicircle. Like if you go in a modern lecture hall and all the seats are in semicircles, they started to have first it started out just a semicircular bench called an exedra, and then they started to make rooms that had several benches like that were designed obviously for a lecture or for some kind of talking. So gymnasia would be a place where you would learn poetry, you would listen to other people reciting poetry, you might learn how to play musical instruments, to do different kinds of dances. The dances in ancient Greece were often group dances, even like they are today, but they were used for military training and other things like that. So it was kind of a very active place that was sort of a center of culture. And I call it as, a place for cultivating arte, because arte is not just about physical excellence. It's also about knowing culture, knowing poetry, being educated and being graceful and all those kinds of things. So that was a very long answer, but that's basically what gymnasia were. And in general, they were public, and almost every major Greek city had them. And they originally were semi-religious, in the sense that there was usually a god to whom the gymnasium was dedicated, and you would make a sacrifice to the god, leave something at the statue of the god as you went in. And sometimes there were actual contests held at the gymnasia that were dedicated to the god. These things were always religious, connected to religion and to politics, to the city, the organization of the city. The private palestra, not anybody could go. You had to sort of have a membership or know the right people. And that was probably just a small wrestling area, which was probably still outdoor. Again, it was probably like a peristyle where it was open in the middle, and then there were rooms around the outside.
Yeah. And what do you know what Plato's school looked like?
Well,
Because
so
his was
Plato's
a very
school was
famous
at the
school,
academy, right? You see, the academy was originally a park. It was like a sanctuary that was walled off, but inside it was just a bunch of trees and streams. And it was dedicated to a hero whose name was Hecatomus, and that's where it got the name of the cat. It was like a sanctuary for worshiping heroes. But part of hero worship seems to have been where we get sport from. It was these imitations of the heroes' feats, and this kind of turned into the kind of exercises that people did. So you wanted a place that was outdoor, that had space to run and wrestle and do other kinds of exercise, and then would have like a stream running through so you could bathe after. So first it starts out as a park, and then they start building these buildings I described. Now Plato founds his school in this sanctuary of Hecatomus, which is outside of Athens, which by Plato's time had already become a very popular place for exercise, might have had a few buildings. Plato himself was a wrestler. He was an Athenian. He might have, actually used to train there when he was a kid. But the peristyle building, the building I'm describing, the one that they found in the academy in Athens actually dates to about the time, maybe a little after, that Plato founds a school there. So what you should imagine is like a beautiful park, with access to water, some statues of heroes and gods, one to the muses, and the muses, there were several of them, and so a lot of times that was a bent, like it would be bent around, and there would be a bench like in a half horseshoe shape. And what would happen is people used to like to sit in that and talk, because you could talk in kind of the horseshoe, and that's where we got the term of excedrin, maybe the eventual format of lecture halls. So Plato founds that school after after Socrates has died, after Plato had been to Sicily and done some other things, and I think he just decided that he wanted a school that was going to mix athletic training with Socratic style conversation, other sorts of things. After that time, the Athens and other Greek cities later developed a thing called the ephebia, which was actually kind of like almost a required, kind of a mixture of school and military service, where young men of a certain age, like all the men of, who turned, let's say 18, or it might have been early, like 15 in that town, would become a class of ephebes. And they would go to school together, so to speak. They would go to the gymnasium together and train and learn military exercises, but also learn other sorts of things that young men need to know. They'd learn about sexuality and marriage